Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through a list of some adult fantasy romance books that are not fourth wing, and I'm approaching this topic in the same way that I have in the past for adult fantasy works that are not Brandon Sanderson. The idea behind this is not in any way to dismiss the impact that those authors and these works have on so many of us. The idea is that we do often find ourselves roped in, or maybe getting back into reading or falling in love with reading for the first time in our entire lives because of the works that certain authors put out. And for a lot of fantasy romance fans, that book has been fourth wing. But there is a next step that I think a lot of us experience after we've fallen in love with something, where we want something similar, maybe not exactly the same, but it gives us enough pieces where that invigoration we feel for reading can continue to be sparked over and over again, but we just don't really know what to pick up. And when we try to look into what to pick up that is like fourth wing or other fantasy romance books, in the case of today's video, you end up getting recommended things that you definitely already know exist. So things like Sarah J. Maas. You can't help but think, yeah, I know about that one. And maybe you've even checked out Sarah J. Maas and you're like, okay, but I want something else at this point. And so that's what I'm hoping to do today and what to provide today. I'm going to have a mix of books, some of which, depending on the circles that maybe you are within in various different bookish spaces, some of these maybe you've heard of, but I hope that there's at least something that I'll mention today that you've never heard of before, or even if you have heard of it, you're reminded of it and you think, okay, I think I need to give that one a try. So we're going to have things that are lesser known, things are a little bit more known. We're going to have self-pub and traditionally published, and we're going to have different, you could almost say subgenres of fantasy romance, so that hopefully there's something for basically anybody to find and enjoy. And I will add that I am also going to be doing a video for, if you like Sarah J. Maas's works, some other books that you might also like, and I ensured when I was making the list for these that there was absolutely no overlap, so that if after today you're looking for more recommendations, you can be on the lookout for that video. It'll be up very soon. Last thing I'll say, and then we'll jump into the books. If you yourself are a voracious fantasy romance reader, feel free to give your own recommendations in the comments. Don't worry about if they're the same as the ones that I end up saying, as that I always think provides further confirmation that these are ones that people might enjoy. And then also, if there's something I haven't talked about, then there's even more recommendations for anybody that comes to this video. Finally, jumping into it, first step, we have Mages of the Wheel. If you have watched my channel even somewhat recently, then you have probably heard about Mages of the Wheel before, as this is probably my favorite fantasy romance book that I've checked out. I have since continued on with the series, and I still need to keep going. There are, I think, 4 books in the main series out, and then a prequel, and the author intends to write more. And the way that this is set up is it has a little bit of what you see in fantasy romance series. I am going to mention the Bridge Kingdom in a bit, and I'm going to use that right now as an example of what I'm mentioning with the formatting, which is a lot of fantasy romance and contemporary romance as well. You will have a standalone or a duology that follows a specific set of characters. And then in the next standalone or duology, you're following side characters that were introduced in the original, which allows for you to read them chronologically or read them out of order, but you don't feel too spoiled if you go about them in the wrong order, because it just actually, if anything, piques your interest for the books that came before and the couple that you see referenced here and there. This does something a little different. It's a version of that, but not exactly, but I wouldn't say it's quite the same as a direct series, even though it does go in chronological order and there is a more formal book 1, book 2. So the way it works is that within this first book, you're being introduced to the greater conflict, as well as what the main character in this book, Naime is her name, the way that she plans to try and fight back against this greater conflict. And as a result of her pursuits, she does meet the person that ends up being her love interest in this story. So you do have a set of characters that you're following within this first one. And I do think it's such a fantastic blend of political fantasy, there's cool magic, and the romantic elements I thought were very well done. But within the sequel, you are now looking at different characters, but I would say there's more significance in the order that you read them, as it's kind of like you're building and building, and you're sort of continuously searching for your party. You're building that ensemble cast, you could say. And the politics, which are so present within the first book, expand, and thus the stakes expand the more that you read within the story. And also because for a lot of people, they like different things with different kinds of characters and relationship building. Chances are, depending on what you like, you're going to find a couple within the series that you enjoy their dynamics, or maybe you like a certain couple well enough, but then you see a hint of something to come and you're like, I think I'm going to like, I hope the author shows that character because I want more of them. So it just kind of creates this excitement as you're reading, as well as developing the world more and more and the magic more and more. The setup for this first one, I already mentioned the character Naime. So I mentioned she is trying to combat this greater threat that she is recognizing will present itself eventually and will impact her country. So she is now trying to rebuild the wheel, you could say, which is like this thing that they reference, and there are different houses with different kinds of magic. Hers has to do more so with air, and there are different kinds of magic users, and there are significant people that can represent the strongest aspects of a certain house or a certain kind of magic, and she is trying to find those individuals and basically rebuild the wheel so that magic can reach a certain point where she can fight back against this external threat that she very much feels is going to present itself relatively soon. In the first book, you are seeing Naime try to reach out to other people to build allies. She's also having to deal with the fact that her father has his health deteriorating, and this includes his memory, but he is currently the Sultan, and so she has to try and help him and ensure that the vultures at court don't see his failing health. So she is doing everything she can to basically keep their kingdom afloat while also maintaining her own sense of agency, and this includes her interactions with her love interest. I love these two characters as individuals. I really enjoyed them together. I thought the world was great. I liked the familial aspects of it, and I think the author did a good job with having both of the characters within this duo feel really well fleshed out, feel like their own characters, have their own personalities, but come together and be a force to be reckoned with. I do think that first one is absolutely a really fantastic balance between fantasy and romance. I think the second one leans more into the romance side of things, which I preferred actually when we kept it a little bit more on the fantasy side of things, or I should say it was more 50-50. But I think for a lot of people, the second one I can very much see being more to their taste if you are more looking for the romantic side of things, as there's a lot of tension with the characters in that second book. Moving on now, because that one leaned, as I just said, a little bit more 50-50, the next ones I want to mention, they're not going to be as high fantasy or as politically driven, and they're definitely going to lean more on the cozy side, which I absolutely think is both a little more approachable, and also it's just such a nice thing to come to after some of the high stakes, more action-packed kinds of stories. And one of them I personally would consider far more cozy than I would romance. So as a result of that, I am going to include a bonus recommendation at the end that truly feels more fantasy romance leaning, but I'm still going to mention it here because some people do consider it fantasy romance. So the three that are more cozy would be the Spellshop is the one that I was just referencing, Half a Soul, and A Deal with the Elf King. A Deal with the Elf King is part of a series of standalones, but they all kind of follow a same blueprint, and they exist within this same world where there are these mythical beings, and within each story, the main character is a human, and they end up, for various reasons, finding themselves entangled with some kind of mythical being. And in this one, you follow a woman who finds herself having to marry the Elf King, and this is to help maintain the certain level of protection and magic within their world. There has to be this balance, and she doesn't really want anything to do with him initially. We've kind of seen this story play out before, but I think it has a sense of coziness as the atmosphere and the setting as she is navigating this new life of hers. I think it has the sense of coziness which plays off of the very thorny behavior of the love interest. He is definitely really grouchy, doesn't really value her very much either. Like, they both go into things pretty tentative and resistant, but then you're watching as things blossom throughout the story. And then there are other ones within this that follow different beings. So you have a vampire, you have fae, and I actually think the vampire one of the three in this series that I've read was the one I liked the most. And I think that they have different things about them that are going to appeal to different people. You don't have to read these in order, so if there's one that the way that the couple is or the plot itself seems more to your liking, then you can definitely pick up whichever within them. But I do think that there's just something about them that doesn't feel too high stakes, that doesn't feel too edge of your seat. There always is this level of, it's kind of like a comfort read, if you will. The Spellshop is just truly so cozy. The setup at the beginning sounds a little sad. You follow this young woman who is a librarian who works at this library where very important magical tomes are kept. And it is her job to ensure that these are never to leave the library unless there's very special circumstances. And at the beginning of the story, there is some kind of rebellion occurring. She sees all these flames outside, so much of the city's burning down. She thinks, oh my gosh, I have to flee. And she grabs her sentient spider plant, which is like almost an animal companion type, and it's very cute. And as many of the books as she can. And she flees, and the only place she can think to go is this like kind of island rural area that she grew up in. And she figures, I'll just go to my old house. I'm sure nobody will even notice, but it's such a small town that everybody there is like, who's this person? And they immediately get in her business. And she realizes, okay, well, first off, I have to keep these books a secret from the rest of the town because I know how dangerous the spells are within these and I can't let anybody know about them. But second, she is now in danger because she realizes, I don't know if the rebellion was successful, and if it was not, I know how strict the ruling class is about these books getting out of the library, and I could very well be in danger right now. However, she kind of can't help resist investigating the contents of these books as, one, she's very intrigued by what they contain, but also she thinks perhaps there are some spells within these books that can help improve the lives of the people in this town. And you also get pieces of the fact that perhaps the town has faced some decline as a result of what the ruling class has insisted upon them when it comes to the restrictions on magic. And so there's actually some social commentary present within that book as well, but it is so cozy and so sweet. And you can probably pick up on the fact that when I stated it doesn't quite feel like fantasy romance, in my opinion, I didn't even mention the love story within this, but there's an individual within the story who is very sweet, and they're just always kind of checking in and making sure she's doing okay, and does she need any help with anything, and they remember her from childhood, and you're like, oh, this is cute, this is sweet, and it was absolutely precious and darling, as was most everything in that book. And plus, Sarah Beth Durst just writes wonderful settings. In this particular story, the setting was very whimsical and vibrant. In other stories, it can be a lot harsher, like the Queens of Renthia series, which is not fantasy romance, but I still think a lot of people might like it if you're a fantasy romance fan. But regardless, I definitely think that that one is cozy and so lovely. And then we have Half a Soul. This is essentially Gaslamp Regency era fantasy, as it does take place in a certain time period when appearances mean everything, and the smallest gesture or expression can be interpreted so many ways, and everybody's going to gossip, and what about this person? Did you see they danced with so-and-so at this event? And it's that sort of a feel. And our main character does not fit in with high society at all, despite the fact that her family is expected at these events, and her cousin is trying to look out for her, and her cousin's like, I have to find a way to help my cousin because she's not able to quite behave in the way that high society expects her to behave. And this is as a result of this thing that occurred when she was a child, where this mythical being stole half of her soul. And the idea is that as a result, her emotions are somewhat muted, and she doesn't seem to understand social cues the same way that everybody else does. And also, she is so genuine that she gets confused about this almost deceptive nature of putting on this front. And it's this very behavior that actually is somewhat appealing to, but also mysterious to, this individual that the cousin seeks out. They're like a court magician, and this nice and well-meaning cousin is thinking, maybe he can cure her, and maybe he can help restore her soul, and then she can be quote-unquote normal. And he actually really values the things that make her different from the rest of society, as he is somebody who's experienced a lot of violence within his life, and he hates the way that high society pretends those things don't even exist, and he actually kind of appreciates a lot of what our main character has to offer. And their dynamic is very cute. and he's kind of grumpy. And I always say it's not so much grump sunshine, but as cheesy as this sounds, I describe it as grump moonlight, because it is kind of this pretty but very different feeling to the sunshine type of character type. I just think it's a very sweet, fun story, and if you like that setting, I think there's a good chance that you'll like that one. Next up is a book that within this first one is not necessarily a fantasy romance, but it is, first off, it's very much enjoyed by a lot of people within fantasy romance circles, and additionally, the author has expressed that there is a romance that takes place over the course of the series, so if you are somebody who likes slow burn, then the author has recommended her works, as that's what's present within them, and that would be Spark of the Everflame. I've actually mentioned that aspects, just a little bit of the world building within this story, remind me the tiniest bit of Arcane. The reason being that you have this society that is somewhat broken apart, and it's very much divided between basically lower classes and upper classes. And you see the way that even one single family member no longer being present or no longer being able to fulfill a certain job has an enormous impact on the rest of the family. And suddenly our main character in particular is finding herself having to take on the role of somewhat like mother and sister to her younger brother, which I think if you've seen Arcane, you can see some of the parallels there. Although I don't think that this character is alike when it comes to the personality of other characters. But regardless, she is having to take on all these roles, and she definitely has her own sense of agency, but it's really hard for her to explore life in all the ways that she wants, as she has so many responsibilities on her shoulders from a very young age. And absolutely, she has these sort of dreams of resisting and fighting back and pushing against the status quo. And she has somebody in her life who is encouraging this of her, but she also has basically another bird on her shoulder telling her, just keep in line, don't go out of your place because it'll put you in danger, I just want you safe. So she has various different family members and figures within her life that are kind of pulling at her from different directions, and she just doesn't know which path to choose. But some of her agency is somewhat changing, I'll say, because of the fact that she is finding herself suddenly able to interact with individuals who do live in the upper classes, and she is starting to have complex feelings about the role that she's playing in potential resistance, and she wants things to change, but she doesn't know how to navigate that, and she has people that she cares about that are on all different sides, because there's a lot of gray area within this, and I just felt like the dynamics of having a family, first off, is something that it's kind of refreshing to see in a story, and actually having a relationship with that family, having a job. In this case, she also has a boyfriend. She has basically what is like a boss, and there's a lot of mysteries as well within her life. But you do kind of explore certain things that I think really connect us to characters from a personal level, of the fact that so many of us feel so trapped. There's class discrepancies, and I feel that in having the character live in a way that is somewhat similar to how a lot of us live, it really allowed for us to understand why it's so difficult for the character to break out and why it's so difficult to make the decisions that she does. And as I said, there's not a whole lot to say about the romance just yet, because that is just the first in the series, but you can tell pretty quickly who the love interest is going to be, because, you know, you can tell. That's all I'll say. Next up is a book that you don't have to wait in order to get the love interest. It's very much present in this first book. This is very much a fantasy romance, and that would be Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher. T. Kingfisher writes a hybrid of, first off, different genres. She often has genre blending within her stories, and I think it's a result of her just exploring so many genres, which I really, really like, but also a hybrid of publishing things traditionally and indie. So she kind of does so much, and I just love the creativity and the chances that she takes. This particular story is funny. It's funny because I feel like this author can't resist being funny. It's not going to sound funny when I first start talking about it. The setup is that you have a society where gods, they don't just exist, but they actually play a role in people's lives. And our main character, he is somebody, and that's another thing I want to add. You actually have a main character when you first start the story who is a man, which is very rare. I feel like almost always you sort of start through the lens of the woman in the story. If it is a couple where it is a woman and a man, you almost always start with the woman's perspective first, and then later you get the man's perspective, if you do at all And so it's kind of fun to have a story where you're more so actually starting with the man's perspective. So that makes it stand out for that reason. But regardless, you have him serving this god, and he's a paladin, which is kind of like a knight. And he serves this god, and then this god dies. And you're now looking at the people that followed him and were devoted to him and what's left of them after their god dies. And it's not just belief that makes this difficult. There's also the fact that various gods had different powers that they could somewhat grant, in a sense, to their followers. And when this god died, his powers sort of surged into his followers in a way where they couldn't control themselves for a certain period of time. And many of them went on basically like killing sprees. And then they were killed, or they eventually came out of it, but now they have to live with the fact that they did not only certain terrible things when they were without the ability to think for themselves, but also that their god is dead and a bunch of their friends are dead too. And that's where you're starting the story. Like I said, it doesn't sound like it would be that funny when you first start, but our main character is somebody who he has this sense of obligation to a lot of the people in his life. He sees them as his brethren, these men and women who were right alongside him and the only people left from this group. And so they very much take care of each other and they're there for each other. Then you have a character that he meets who he takes on odd jobs here and there, basically as a guard. He'll be hired to help walk somebody across the city and make sure they're not hurt, that sort of thing. And he happens to be helping this woman one day who is what I'm going to call divorced perfumer. She definitely had something occur with a relationship in her past, and now she's just trying to start fresh and have her little perfume business. And there's also something going on where there's people dying in the city, and they kind of get wrapped up in that, and also they just can't seem to stop thinking about each other, and he finds reasons to visit her, and she wants to get to know more about him, but also both of their pasts definitely play a role in their present day lives. And another thing that sets this book apart from a lot of the others that I've read is that these are not really, really young characters. They're adults who have lived a lot of life already, and as a result, they have certain obligations in their life. Obligations maybe is too harsh of a way to put it, but they have people in their lives that they care about, or things in their life that they care about, that they need to dedicate time to. And for him, those are the people that he ensures that he helps take care of, and they help take care of him. He can't really drop them for this woman that he's interested in. She's trying to start fresh. She has this business that she's running, and her ex maybe isn't totally out of her life, and so she has a lot of her own things that she has to deal with, and it's kind of like finding each other and love and building a relationship and a connection through all of that, which to me is very realistic for a lot of people who have a life. They have things going on, and so finding love through those things is something that you have to really, really work for. And I really liked the way that it was executed. As I said, T. Kingfisher, so goofy sometimes. I would say that certain books, the humor is a little more cheeky. Sometimes the humor is a little bit more subtle or sarcastic. In that one, it's somewhat like situational humor. Not actually my favorite humor of hers, but it's a fun time regardless. And as I said, there's things that make that book, I think, unique from a lot of other fantasy romance. After that, I know that this is not an unknown. I'm sure most people have heard about it, but we have both The Bridge Kingdom and A Fate Inked in Blood. The Bridge Kingdom has sort of been present in a lot of self-pub and indie spaces. If you're a self-pub and indie reviewer, I'm sure you've at the very least heard of it, if not even given it a go yourself. This does follow what I mentioned at the beginning of you have a duology following certain characters, then you'll have another duology following characters that were introduced in this one. And what's interesting is the way that Danielle Jensen wrote this is that there's actually some overlap timeline-wise. So you actually see certain events through other characters' perspectives, which did make this second book in this duology interesting, because you're like, I don't know what was going on over there, but suddenly these characters are involved in this plot line, and then you kind of get the gaps filled in. But the point with the first book's synopsis is that you have these two characters, Lara and Aaron. Lara has been trained since the time that she was young to basically fulfill a marriage alliance and then serve as a spy to the man that she's supposed to be married off to, her and her sisters, just in case something happened. They've all been trained for this. So she gets married off to serve as a spy and report back to her father, whose plan is to use the information that she gives him to try and take over the Bridge Kingdom that Aaron rules. Aaron, fully aware that that's likely what's going to be happening. So he doesn't trust her at all when she first enters the picture. I think they actually represent enemies to lovers, that trope, because sometimes that trope gets thrown around, that label gets thrown around like it's nothing, and you're like, that wasn't what that was. These characters actually are like, I don't trust you, I think you're my enemy, I think you're lying to me, I think you're putting on a front, what are you gonna do? And I just really appreciated seeing the way that they try to navigate their roles, and I enjoyed the politics quite a bit. I will say I have a soft spot for political fantasy, if you haven't been able to tell by the fact that I always hype that aspect up on books that contain that. The other one, though, that she has would be A Fate Inked in Blood. This one has started traditionally published, so I think you've probably seen it in bookstores a lot more. The Bridge Kingdom recently got picked up, so it's starting to be in retail stores also, but A Fate Inked in Blood is interesting because it's much more fantasy. You actually have a magic system in this to some degree, whereas the Bridge Kingdom, it's mostly fantasy because it's just a different world. This one has magic, and it's very much sort of Norse-inspired, which I thought that it was explored well. I thought that the setting was a lot of fun. I liked the dynamic between the characters. I liked the characters themselves. I actually think this one feels tropier, and that can be a positive or negative depending on what you're looking for. If you like navigating tropes, or even if you are newer to the genre and you feel like you're not maybe burnt out on certain tropes, then this one might be a lot of fun. You might like this one more. There's certainly tropes in the Bridge Kingdom as well, but I think that this one embraces a lot of them, and I can absolutely see people having a good time getting to scratch that itch that I think certain tropes provide for them. We also have 2 other books written by the same author, similar to how I presented 2 different series by Danielle Jensen. So this next one would be Serpent and the Wings of Night, as well as Daughter of No Worlds. And just a heads up, I'll recommend books even if I didn't 100% find that they worked for me. So me not having the books isn't to say that I think that these books aren't that good, but I'll recommend them to you. It's nothing like that. I don't have these books because at the end of the day, there were certain things that didn't work perfectly for me. But first off, I still enjoyed them. And second, I definitely understand why so many people really love these. The couple in Daughter of No Worlds was actually one of my favorites that I've come across in any fantasy romance book. The love interest in particular is very different from the love interests you get in so many other stories. I actually feel like the couple had an organic building of trust, respect, then attraction, and then that attraction turned into something more. And you're seeing something I think this author does in both A Daughter of No Worlds and Serpent and the Wings of Night, is that both characters, you get the opportunity to explore the trauma that they've endured in their lives. So it's not just, I think, this sort of cliche that people have in their heads of how things play out, which is that the woman's gone through something and then we explore that, and then the man is just so supportive and nice and perfect and he just helps her with everything. I think that this author takes the time to ensure that both of the characters within the relationship feel like real human beings. They get to know each other. The more that because it does kind of start from the woman's perspective, the more that she gets to know him, the more that you as the reader get to know him, the more you get to see his perspective on things. And so it kind of makes you feel more connected to both of them because you feel like you're getting to know him in the same way that she's getting to know him. And as I said, this is present in both series. Daughter of No Worlds is, I would say, more of just a creative world and magic, whereas Serpent and the Wings of Night, it has a competition setting, and specifically a human who is competing against vampires, and the reason that she's doing this is because if she can win, then she will be able to potentially gain powers that would make her on equal footing with the vampires. The only way she's even somewhat confident enough to go up against them is because she was raised by not just a vampire, but basically the ruler of all the vampires, so she knows how to fight them. She's been trained her whole life when it comes to combat and weaponry, so that's why she feels like, okay, I can at least have a chance, but I'm tired of having to work so much harder for things that just come easy to them. So you do kind of have this underdog feeling within that one. Daughter of No Worlds is arguably darker in its setting and what the main character has endured in her life when you first start the story and you see what she's had to go through. But she's also a lot different from your typical protagonist, because I would say there are a lot of these women who are very cutthroat and they're very well trained, kind of what I was just describing with Serpent and the Wings of Night. And then in this character, she's quieter and she's kind of like softer in a lot of ways. She sort of resists magic and power because she doesn't really want to harm people. She just sort of wants, she likes the things that can make people happy, that make her happy, but you do sort of explore her sort of gaining confidence in herself as you unpack a lot of what she's been through and as she unpacks it. And then last for today, the one that I said was kind of a bonus one because the Spellshop maybe isn't quite as fantasy romance as some of the others, and that would be the book Radiance. If you like a story where the characters have a lot of banter with each other, there's probably not one that's going to fit that better than this one does. The setup is you have these two characters in this fantasy world who are of two different humanoid races. The woman is basically just a human, and the man is kind of vampire-like in a sense, but the features aren't necessarily just purely like they have fangs and they drink blood. It's not like that necessarily, but there is some connection to daylight versus sunlight, daylight versus night, and they have skin that is kind of this gray color. They don't necessarily have whites in their eyes, they just sort of have a color that goes across, and they have sharper teeth, so they look somewhat monstrous. And these two characters, they do not find each other attractive at all. He compares her to a horse all the time, which is really funny because her teeth aren't sharp. And she tells him that he looks like the monsters that she imagined finding under her bed as a child. Like, they are very honest and like silly with each other. And they start this marriage because there is a marriage alliance between the two of them. They start it from a place of recognizing, I don't know that either of us would have chosen this for ourselves. So I think the best we can do is be honest and just try to make the best of the situation. I want you to be comfortable. And then the other's like, well, I want you to be comfortable too. And so they just have this really sweet friendship that starts. And the more that they get to know each other and the more that the two of them go up against obstacles together, the more that respect builds. And then there is some attraction that starts to happen. But there is this constant banter between the two of them that is actually quite cute. That's it, though, for some adult fantasy romance books that if you have heard about Fourth Wing and you're like, okay, I'm ready to hear about some other things, hopefully there was something in this list that piqued your interest. And if you are interested in any of these, I'll have all of them linked in the description bar down below. As I said, please, if you have your own recommendations, feel free to mention those in the comments, and then be on the lookout for if you like Sarah J. Maas's works, try these others because you'll get some more recommendations there. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.